Well, we've come to the end of our journey through Edward's life. We're in these final years of his life. When we left him last, he was embroiled in this controversy at Northampton, and out of that he heads west, out to the frontier town of Stockbridge. We talked a little bit about Stockbridge, but I want to go over that a little bit more. As Edwards gets to Stockbridge, obviously this is an entirely different congregation than what he had been accustomed to at Northampton. The congregation at Northampton was close to 700 strong. Edwards could obviously preach to them in a language they understood. They all spoke English, and they had been used to Solomon Stoddard's preaching. They had been used to Edwards' preaching. Well, now Edwards finds himself in Stockbridge. As I had mentioned in one of our earlier sessions, Stockbridge was comprised of about 250 or so Native Americans. They were mostly the Mohicans. And if you remember your chronology from colonial times, this is right at the time of what used to be called the French and Indian War, and now is mostly called the 7 Years' War. And the Mohicans were significantly involved in that war on the side of the British. And this group at Stockbridge is in fact the last of the Mohicans' fame. And there's even going to be a member of this group that is going to be the inspiration for the character Hawkeye of James Fenimore Cooper's novel. Although James Fenimore Cooper is going to use a little bit of literary license because the model he uses was actually involved in the American Revolutionary War and not in the 7 Years' War. The person that is the model for Hawkeye, it goes on to be the chief of the Mohicans. And once they leave Stockbridge, they move over to Albany, and then they move from Albany eventually all the way out west to Wisconsin, where the Mohican Indian tribe is now. But the chief, this Hawkeye character, his name was Hendrick Alpamut. And Hendrick Alpamut was born during the time that Edwards was minister at the Stockbridge Church. And Hendrick Alpamut was baptized by Jonathan Edwards. He went on to fight in the Revolutionary War, and the legend has it that he single-handedly overtook an entire British garrison by himself, numbering somewhere around 30 soldiers. Now, I don't know if that was true or not, but you can see where Cooper would be intrigued by this guy and use him as a model. Well, years later, Hendrick Alpamut wrote a letter to Timothy Edwards. Timothy was one of Jonathan Edwards' sons who stayed in Stockbridge and was a merchant. He had a store there in Stockbridge. And he became friends with Alpamut. And Hendrick Alpamut sent a letter to Timothy, and in this letter he says, my friend, and he asks him some pleasantries, and then he says, wonder if you would send me a book. The author is your father. Concerning, and the manuscript's worn out here, but you can make out what he's saying, concerning affections. He wants to read the book, Religious Affections. And then he says, or if you haven't such, wish to have the other mentioned, the will. He wants to read Freedom of the Will. Now, I can't get my undergrads to read Freedom of the Will, and this Mohican Indian chief wants to read Freedom of the Will. Let me tell you a little bit of something about Alpamut. Alpamut went on to translate the Westminster Shorter Catechism into the Mohican language. This shows the legacy of Edwards' ministry at Stockbridge. That decades later, the chief of the Mohican Indians is asking for his books, and this chief is translating the Westminster Shorter Catechism into Mohican. One of Edwards' other sons, Jonathan Edwards Jr., was only about 7 years old when they moved to Stockbridge. As you can imagine, this would be a 7-year-old boy's dream, right? His teenage sisters, they wanted nothing to do with this. They marry, they get out of there. Not Jonathan Edwards Jr. He loves this. In fact, he picks up Mohican very quickly. And even Mohawk, he picks up both languages. And he spends all of his time playing with the Mohican boys. And he, even when he was just about 10 years old, accompanied John Brainerd, who was David Brainerd's brother, on a missionary journey far into the Adirondack Mountains to an Indian tribe. Edwards Jr. went on to write the first and only grammar of the Mohican language, just a small 12-page grammar. And George Washington, in fact, ended up sending Jonathan Edwards Jr. a letter of appreciation. Washington was in the task of trying to gather up material on the Indian languages before they all disappeared. And he'd come across J.E. Jr.'s, that's what we call them, J.E. Jr.'s manuscript on the grammar of the Mohican language. And so he sent him an appreciative letter. I tried to steal it from the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, but I got caught and I had to give it back. It was very embarrassing. But his family was fully engaged in life there at Stockbridge. Edwards not only preached to the Indians, he also was very much engaged in Indian affairs. In fact, in the next town over, there were some British who stole some horses from some Native Americans. And the Native Americans set off to chase the British who had stolen their horses. And in the course of the pursuit, the British shot upon and in fact killed 2 of the Native Americans that were in pursuit of them. Now, according to the law, the government was to give money to pay tribute to the family of those Indians. And they were long in delaying and paying it. And Edward started writing letters on their behalf to the governor of Massachusetts, telling him what a grave injustice this is, and also using this as an occasion to speak of the other injustices that he saw on behalf of the English, as they were called, towards the Indians. I already mentioned to you Edward's statement that too often the English of Massachusetts were too interested in fixing the Indians in their interest than preaching the gospel to them. At one time, Edwards was invited to preach at a signing of a treaty with the Mohawks. And you can imagine the scene. There's the Mohawk chief, and there's all the tribal leaders, and then there's the governor of Massachusetts and various dignitaries from the assembly. And there was Edwards. And he began to preach. And his sermon was essentially, we have done wrong by you. We have the light of the gospel, and we haven't done what we should have done in sharing it with you. I can just imagine that as that sermon unfolded, the governor started, adjusting his collar. My goodness, it's getting hot in here. And everybody was sort of squirming a little. And that probably wasn't the sermon they had hoped Edwards would preach. It's also interesting that in the years prior to 1750, there was all of this land that was bought up from the Native Americans. In 1739, when they chartered the town, they carved out land for the Native Americans. And the English, there were about a dozen families in the 1750s. Most of them were Williams, and one of them was Abigail Williams, the widow of John Sargent, and she stayed there. So there's poor Edwards again, dealing with the Williams family. And they accused Edwards of stealing money from the mission, believe it or not. Again, I am a man seems to be born of strife, right? Not all of Edwards' life was charmed and worry-free. But there were about a dozen or so English family. And what happened is they started buying up this land and essentially tricking the Native Americans. And then you see it after 1758. In fact, so much so that the Mohicans no longer had any land in Stockbridge. And so they were forced to move to Albany, and then they were forced to move to Wisconsin. But in those years, 1750 to 1758, you don't see the land sales. Those are the years that correspond to Edwards' tenure as minister. So Edwards was preaching the gospel, but he was also very concerned with the humanitarian side of things in his dealing with the Mohican Indians. Now, much of this we never talked about. In fact, for years, Edward's time at Stockbridge was referred to as his sabbatical. I've heard people even refer to it as that recently. The idea is that Edwards was so busy at Northampton, he finally gives up his busy pastoral ministry, goes to Stockbridge, where he had occasionally to preach a sermon every Sunday, and he had a translator, and he had a whole batch full of sermons, so he really wasn't spending much time in sermon preparation. He was preaching very short sermons, so essentially he was freed up to write. And Edwards did. He did write significantly. In fact, it's in the 1750s that he produces these great treatises. The Treatise on Original Sin, the Treatise on Freedom of the Will. The Encyclopedia Britannica says, based on the freedom of the will, Edwards is the greatest philosopher. Get that, not theologian, the greatest philosopher ever born on American soil. Freedom of the Will, that book that Hendrik Alpement wanted to read, this dense philosophical treatise. He writes the 2 dissertations. He fills his miscellany notebooks again, and he begins pursuing some other ideas that his death prevents him from finishing. So it is true that Edwards wrote significantly during this time. But when you stop and think about it, he exchanges a congregation of 600 for a congregation of about 200. And yes, this is what pastors do when they go from one city to another. They sort of go back through those old sermon files and say, what can I rework here? So Edwards certainly wasn't putting as much time into sermon preparation as he was. So he could write. But in no way was it a sabbatical. In fact, you could make a case that Edwards was more engaged in the pastoral aspects of church life at Stockbridge than he ever was at Northampton. As 1757 is coming to a close, Aaron Burr, Edward's son-in-law, dies. And the trustees of the College of New Jersey, which comes to be known as Princeton, send a letter. In fact, Richard Stockton writes the letter, and Richard Stockton goes on to be one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and he was a trustee of Princeton. Writes a letter to Jonathan Edwards inviting him to be the president of Princeton. Now, Edwards should have said no, because Aaron Burr held the presidency for only a couple of years, died. Prior to him, Samuel Davies had the presidency for just a year or two, and he died. This was a bad track record of presidents dying. If I had been there to advise Edwards, I probably would have said, don't do it. Don't do it. And in fact, Edwards didn't want to do it. And in fact, he writes in another letter that when he received the letter, everything within him wanted to say no. But remember, I had mentioned that these congregational churches were sort of functioning like a presbytery. So Edwards submitted the letter and the decision to the Synod of Ministers, not in the Hampshire County, but in the next region over. And they said, we think you should go. Now, maybe it's because they were Williams and they just wanted to be rid of him. But actually, this group actually liked Edwards, and there were very few Williams that were part of that ministers' association. And they said you should go. When Edwards got the letter from that ministers' association, he writes that he literally wept in his home at Stockbridge. I don't think he wanted to do it. I think he was very much enjoying his pastoral ministry at Stockbridge. He had some book ideas he wanted to write. He was enjoying life there. He already had the academic piece, back at the beginning with Yale. I don't think he wanted to do it. But he decided to submit to the wisdom of the Council of Pastors. And so he consented. And so in January of 1758, Edwards preaches his second farewell sermon. This one under much more favorable circumstances. And he sadly leaves and goes down to Princeton. Now, it's winter, and Edwards decides that he is going to go down, and Sarah will remain in Stockbridge. He actually had some property off somewhere in the Berkshire Mountains. Minister's retirement was in property. They would give them acres of woods somewhere, which was actually pretty lucrative because those woods then could be used for furniture and etc. So wooded acres was sort of a nice retirement package. And they thought as they moved down to Princeton, they should just sell off that property. Sarah was going to sort of take care of the closing up the house there in Stockbridge, and Edwards would get the president's house ready there in Princeton. And sometime in the late spring, Sarah would come and join him in Princeton. So after he preaches his farewell sermon in January of 1758, he travels down to Princeton by himself. He moves into the president's house. This is actually a rendering of Princeton, and these were the two buildings that were there in Edwards' time, and these buildings are actually still there now. This building is called Nassau Hall, and this is where the students lived. It's where they ate. That's where the classrooms were. And then this is the president's house. This corner up here is Edwards' bedroom. And so this window right here is where Edwards was looking out when he died. The president's house is still there today. It's actually the alumni house. I've taken many groups through there, and the poor person whose office that used to be Edwards' bedroom where Edwards died is sort of used to people coming in. He no longer even looks up. He just sits at his desk, and when people walk in the door, he says, "The bed was here. That's where Edwards died. He was looking out that window. The fireplace was here. Nothing else was here." And he doesn't even look up. He knows why people are there. Edwards assumes the office, holds it for about 6 weeks of good health. In February, he takes a smallpox inoculation. This smallpox inoculation was actually made up by one of the Mathers, and Edwards took it to show the students that they had nothing to fear. And Edwards was always intrigued by science and scientific inquiry and discovery, so he partook of the smallpox inoculation. Well, he reacted to it. And in fact, so did his daughter, Esther Edwards Burr, who's recently widowed. She also partook of the same smallpox inoculation. And by the end of February, both had a serious reaction to it. Edwards' throat swelled up, and he actually died of dehydration, which is a very painful, very slow way to die. These days, it would have been easy. An IV and fluids, and he would have been fine. But there was no such thing in 1758, and so Edwards died. As he was ill, and while he was still able to talk, he dictates a letter that one of his other daughters was there at the time to help in the raising of the two children, and she was going to live there in the house. And he dictates a letter to her that is to be for Sarah, and it is in that letter that he speaks of the uncommon union that he has with Sarah. And on March 22nd, 1758, Jonathan Edwards dies of a dehydration. Esther dies that same month. Sarah then is going to come to Philadelphia. The children of Esther were living with friends in Philadelphia. Sarah she went to Philadelphia in the summer of 1758, and she was going to raise, as a widow, the two children of her daughter. Sarah contracts dysentery at the end of the summer, and by the fall, Sarah too dies, and she's buried with her husband in Princeton Cemetery. And there is the grave for Edwards with the stone on the top. The carving is all in Latin. And then on the back side of the stone is the stone for Sarah, and that is in English. So at least you can interpret one of those, unless you know Latin. But this is the end of Edwards. Now, to be 55 years old in the 1700s was actually a pretty long life. That was beyond the typical lifespan. Now, if you remove infant mortality from that lifespan, it significantly increases. But it's still, and even though we're Calvinists, we shouldn't say this, but it's still something to speak of as an untimely death of Jonathan Edwards. He left a lot of things unfinished that I wish he had finished. It seems like he was just finally crystallizing his ideas at the time of his death. But we can't really say it was an untimely death, can we? It was all in the plan of God. If we go back to that sermon series of Isaiah, chapter 51, verse 8, the 30 sermon series, History of Work of Redemption, this is the text. For the moth will eat them up like a garment, and the worm will eat them like wool. You know, on the surface, things don't look good. On the surface, things are really in a bad state. Things are temporary. Things get destroyed. Things unravel. Things aren't quite like we hope them to be. But, the text continues, but my righteousness will be forever, and my salvation to all generations. All appearances to the contrary, God's work of redemption will, in fact, be. God's work of redemption is the reality. Edwards knew that, and so he ties this in then to the doctrine of providence. And I just want to end with this. This is from those sermons of application. In fact, this is from the last sermon, the 30th sermon in the sermon series, History of the Work of Redemption. Edwards says, God's providence may not unfitly be compared to a large and long river, having innumerable branches, beginning in different regions, and at a great distance one from another, and all conspiring to one common issue. After their very diverse and apparent contrary courses, they all collect together, the nearer they come to their common end, and at length discharge themselves at one mouth into the same ocean. So picture it, a big river, and eventually it gets to its destination. The different streams of this river are apt to appear like mere confusion to us because of our limited sight. We only see the moth destroying the garment, see. Their course seems very crooked, and different streams seem to run for a while different and contrary ways. And then he says, and if we view things at a distance, we say, well, what if I had a bird's eye view of my life? You know, I'm not just right up against the river. What if I could see where my whole life would go? Edwards would say, well, that's worse. Because if you had that whole view of your life, you know what you'll see? This is what he says. You'll see innumerable obstacles and impediments in the way. You'd see a dismissal in 1750. You'd see the Williams clan dogging him wherever he went. You'd see the death of a son-in-law, the death of a daughter. See these innumerable obstacles, impediments as rocks and mountains and the like, to hinder their ever uniting and coming to the ocean. If we could have that bird's eye view of our life, it would likely scare us to death. But yet, if we trace them, they all unite at last. They all come to the same issue, discharging themselves into one and the same ocean. Not one of all the streams shall fail. Not one of all the streams shall fail. My righteousness will be forever, my salvation to all generations. All appearances to the contrary, we can speak of Edward's untimely death. No, not one of all the streams will fail. We can see the harshness of one by one these family members dying in 1758. Not one of all the streams will fail. We can see the conflict at Northampton and say, how? Not one of all these streams will fail. Edwards didn't have a charmed life. Like you, his life was also touched by challenges and difficulties, but there was a theological truth he was able to hold on to. Redemption, God's salvation, it will be there from generation to generation. Not one of all these streams will fail. These are some of the things we can learn from this life of Jonathan Edwards.